One of the driving concepts behind the tholonic idea is that there are energies, and dimensions, and realities, etc., beyond what we see, and they can be approached rationally, scientifically, without any of the baggage that comes with, I guess, what we can call like the New Age thinking or the esoteric, mystical, spiritual stuff. Not that either of those are invalid, but they don't aid in trying to understand these from a very rational perspective. And the reason I even got into the tholonic thing in the first place was, and I'll give you a very brief background of this particular spectrum of my life, and that is I've been in and out of my body many, many times, many different ways, in many different circumstances. And this has been going on since I was 6 or 7 years old, which is when I had my first out-of-body experience, and thought it was amazing. And that was before I kind of grew up a little bit and went out into the world, and it started to cause problems for me, especially in the very small farm town that I lived in, population 200, up near the Canadian border, where you couldn't talk about these things. And this was in the 60s, so it was a whole nother reality back then. I can't control very well, I can control a little bit when and how I leave my body. But it happens all the time, more or less spontaneously. And sometimes when I really least expect it, when I'm sure it's not going to be possible. And then it happens. So I have a lot of experience in these alternative spaces. And my intention behind the Tholonic project was to bring some rational understanding to the way things work in reality, or at least the reality that I live in, which is this one, and these other ones that I experience. And this comes after years of looking into all sorts of alternative models of reality, from the mystical traditions to shamanism to the occult to various spiritual, religious, and psychological paths. And some of them were completely worthless. Some of them were dangerous and dark. Some were very misleading. And others were really insightful and valuable and quite powerful. But none of them presented a model or a paradigm or a view that really worked for me, or really didn't work for the world that we live in now. But they did help lay the foundation for what ultimately would be some sort of kind of coherent integration of all of these different ideas, but based in the rational scientific method that the Tholonic model is attempting to express clearly, with the goal of providing a model or framework that allows us to integrate these alternative realities and experiences and senses, kind of similar to the way electricity used to be considered as some form of mystical magic, and then once we understood how it worked, we all got indoor lighting. Just right off the bat, for anyone who thinks that alternative or multidimensional realities, they probably shouldn't be listening to the rest of this. There's no question in my mind that these were not only real, but significantly more real than the daily reality that we all deal with. And anyone who's had this type of experience knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's like the veil is ripped from your eyes and you are seeing what is really real. And then you come back to this world and it's like, yeah, very little of it is real. In fact, a number of people who have had either near-death experiences or these alternative reality experiences, when they come back, some of them get really depressed and bummed out that they're stuck in what feels to them like a completely fake reality. Or perhaps it's better to say a simulation of reality, similar to how looking at a picture of a sunny beach is a simulation of the reality of a sunny beach. I want to share a particular experience that I had, which was a new technique or a new way, a new method of, I wouldn't exactly say it's leaving the body, but it is absolutely moving your consciousness to another domain or another reality or another physical location. It's not the same as remote viewing because you're really, really there. And the interesting thing about it is it doesn't require like a meditative state. I was able to maintain this state of alternate consciousness while having a conversation with somebody. I mean, I was sitting with my eyes closed. I was on the roof of my house, and somebody was in the roof garden, and they were talking to me, and I was responding back to them. I was able to maintain this dual consciousness, one in another place and one in the physical place that I was in. And I'm pretty confident that this new type of experience was directly the result of the work that I was doing with this tholonic idea. And even more so, I'm confident that this new technique is more about accessing the potential of our existing neurology, as in this is a capacity that we're born with and just never learn how to use. And there's some indication of that if we look at ancient traditions where they did know how to tap into that. But in our modern world, that's kind of fallen out of style and we've forgotten about it. Now, bizarrely, this ability that I'm about to share, it lasted, I don't know, maybe a year. I was able to, maybe 9 months. I was able to do this sometimes with absolute ease. I only needed a few minutes with my eyes closed, and I was out. And then it went away. I couldn't do it anymore. And when I tried to force it, I would get very bad headaches. And sometimes, if I did manage to get some effect, I had physical consequences. Like at one moment, my body became unbearably itchy for some reason. I was trying to force the experience and the energy, I guess. So I guess that's something that you don't want to do. Then it came back again for a couple of months, and then it left again, and then it came back. So I'm not exactly sure how to make it happen, but the process that I'm going to explain, if you do it when it's capable of happening, it will happen. And if it's not capable, okay, then yeah, you don't continue. The metaphor in my mind while I was doing this was like, it's kind of like surfing. You need to learn how to surf, but you can't until there's a wave, right? So you're kind of sitting out there on your surfboard. Sometimes a wave comes by. Sometimes it's a big wave, and sometimes it's a little wave. And you just have to kind of navigate whatever it is that's coming to you. And if you try to surf and there's not a wave, you're not going anywhere. So it's very much like that, because it really feels like you're hooking yourself or catching some kind of a wave of energy that's kind of always there, but perhaps not always moving, and you're kind of going with it. But you maintain your consciousness in your physical body. You're not going to drop into some kind of delta, theta, alpha wave brain activity. On the contrary, your brain waves are going to be beta, maybe even gamma. You're going to be hyper aware. You're going to be extremely conscious and aware and even interactive with the environment around you. So rather than thinking of it as going into an altered state, it's more like you're expanding the spectrum of states that your consciousness can manage. Right? You're not leaving one consciousness, you're not leaving your physical consciousness to go into this metaphysical consciousness. No, you're staying in your physical consciousness and expanding it to include the metaphysical. It might be similar to when you're looking at a spectrum, but you're only seeing red, and when you expand the spectrum, you can see red and green at the same time, which may seem impossible for someone who's only seen red. How can they possibly see red and its opposite, green, at the same time? But obviously, when we look at a spectrum, we see red and green, and it makes perfect sense. Okay, so I'm going to post my journal on the Tholonia blog. I think I have some instructions that I've written out. I'll probably post those as well. Whatever I have, I'm going to put up there, because I was taking notes the whole time that this was happening over the course of a couple of years. And for now, we'll just leave that there, and I'll explain this process. And I would be very interested to hear, if anyone tries this, what their experiences are. And I think there's one more thing I should say up front, and that is some of the experiences that I'll be sharing, especially in follow-up videos, might sound frightening or terrifying. But at no time did I feel frightened. I might have felt a little extra attentive, but I wasn't frightened because, as my consciousness was in both places at the same time, this other reality and my physical one, at no point did I ever feel like I was out of control. I knew all I had to do was open my eyes and everything would be fine. So my physical consciousness kept me very safe and secure. At least that's how I felt. Of course, your mileage may vary. Okay, the first part I'm calling connecting with the brain. So to begin, it's probably best to sit in a time and a place that'll be relatively quiet and not too bright. Once you get the hang of it, you can be in any position in almost any environment, dark or light. Close your eyes, and if it helps, cover your eyes so as not to be too distracted by the light. A little bit of light actually is good. If it's pitch black, it's actually more difficult. So a little bit of light coming through your eyes. And it'll be explained later why that's the case. Okay. Once you're relaxed and all settled in, just stare into the black void of space that you're looking into. And get a sense that you know that it's an infinite void of space. It's just that there's no light, so you can't see anything. But basically what you're doing is you're telling your brain how to interpret this blackness. It might be helpful to imagine that you're standing at the very edge of the expanding universe, beyond all the stars, looking into the nothingness that the universe is expanding into. But it also works if you just imagine you're looking into a dark closet. This is just a mental construct that we use to inform the brain that the blackness is not nothingness, but something that we just can't see yet. To bring this construct into reality for your brain, focus your eyes to some imaginary point a comfortable distance away. This will send signals to the brain that the blackness is actually a space, and the brain will respond similar to how it would respond to being in a totally black room. We now have a psychological bridge between the imaginary concept of space and your brain accepting that as a reality, activating your brain's pre-programmed wiring to process input accordingly, even if that input is internal stimuli. And that internal stimuli comes from the fact that the brain is not only a state-of-the-art pattern recognition machine, it's addicted to pattern recognition. So much so that it will even find patterns looking at a uniform field of light, or no light in this case. Essentially, we're trying to invoke a form of auto-hallucinatory abilities that your brain has. And they have different names, such as the Ganzfeld effect, the Charles Barnett syndrome, closed-eye hallucinations, and even colloquial terms like the prisoner's cinema. There's a bunch of videos out there that if you search, you'll find out how you can create these auto-hallucinations and the physiology that kind of makes them happen. There's also an excellent academic book called Caves and the Ancient Greek Mind, Descending Underground in the Search for Ultimate Truth. The author and PhD from the Institute of Archaeology of the Academy of Sciences in the USSR, whose name is Yulia Ustinova, explains how the ancient Greeks would enter pitch-black caves in order to receive their visions, which is essentially what we're doing here. So, in short, the brain will create its own stimulus when there isn't any readily available externally. The brain really does not like being bored. So, shortly after you've entered your cave, the brain will begin to create some sort of visual stimulus. At first, this stimulus will be slight. Whether this is due to the brain's laziness or efficiency, because it's doing something new and therefore using less developed neural paths, or some other reason, is a question for those who understand more about how the brain works. Regardless, expect to see meaningless and barely perceptible shapes, like lines and forms, and some are so imperceptible that you won't be able to tell if you are actually seeing them or only think you are seeing them, which is kind of a fascinating concept. But considering the images are coming from your brain and not from the outside, there is a very fine line between thinking you see something and seeing something, and that line gets fuzzy. You can even test this yourself by thinking of something like a shape. Nothing fancy, just start with like a circle or a triangle in the middle of the void. Put your attention on the outline of the shape that you have imagined, and then try and quote-unquote see the shape. Once you recognize the shape visually, change to another shape. In my experience, that change typically takes about 1 to 3 seconds. But the point is, you can actually control what you are seeing simply by your intention of wanting to see it, which is pretty profound. In my mind, this is kind of metaphorically similar to that phenomena when you hear a sound, like a repetitive sound, like the tick-tock of a clock, and even though the tick-tock of a clock, each sound is similar, you can imagine one tick being a slightly higher pitch than the tock. And instead of the sound just being tick, 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 the sound becomes tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. But that difference in pitch is completely in your own brain, created by your imagination, and probably your brain's need for variety in its never-ending battle against monotony. In this context, you may find it difficult to distinguish between seeing and being aware of. It'll be useful to try and comprehend how they are different and how they are the same. And as you contemplate on this, consider how you can see your hand even when your eyes are closed. Just hold your hand up in front of your closed eyes, and the brain will project an outline of the hand that it's quite familiar with. Like the brain knows the hand is in front of you, so it will tell the brain, oh, the hand's in front of you, and you'll see an outline of your hand. If you move your fingers, the brain will, process that accordingly, and you will see a soft outline of your hand moving. This is actually something called proprioception, which is when your nervous system knows where your hand is, and your brain knows what the hand is, and together they form an accurate signal of the hands that the brain responds to by forming a phantom or kinesthetic image of your hand, which you can sense and see with your eyes closed. The same will be true if you're in a room that you're very familiar with and your eyes are closed. You will think you can see a faint form of a curtain or a desk or your bed or whatever that the brain projects out into this empty canvas of blackness. Okay, now comes the trickier part. After some time, which in my case has been anywhere between minutes or hours, depending on what, state my brain is in, the brain might increase the stimulus by introducing one or more dots of light, like the smallest stars in the sky, or increase the light in the previously barely perceptible forms, making them easier to see. It's like the brain starting to get desperate for more stimulus. The trick is to catch these random stimuli by focusing your attention on them. And here's where the tricky part comes in, because you'll find that staring directly at the stimulus is difficult, if not impossible, as it will avoid direct observation and just disappear. And this is because the stimulus is activating the rod receptors in your brain, not the cone receptors. And it's the rods of your eyes that are sensitive to very low light conditions, meaning they're hypersensitive to very low energy levels. Those are the ones that are getting stimulated as you're staring into the blackness. Unfortunately, the rods are on the outside of the retina, not the inside, right? The inside is the cones, and those are the ones that are, high resolution and pick up all the colors and everything. And the rods are on the outside. So when you focus your attention on these really low light, low stimulus inputs, you're moving the image into the cones of your eyes. And the cones are not going to pick up the signal, because the cones need a lot more signal than what the brain is sending. So you can't look directly at the stimulus. What you need to do, and this is actually a really good exercise to practice just as you're walking down the street, put your eyes in one direction, like straight ahead, but put your attention somewhere else. Like maybe walking down the street's a bad example. You're sitting in a waiting room. That's a better example. You put your eyes towards the picture on the wall, but you move your attention to the door next to the picture on the wall. So, for example, your eyes don't move, but you take your attention and you start at the bottom of the door frame, for example, and you move your attention up the door frame, across the top, and down the other side, that sort of thing. You're literally exercising, intentionally focusing your awareness separate from where your eyes are pointing. And this is actually kind of a really big deal, because we're so accustomed to associating what we are looking at with where our awareness is. It's rare that our awareness detaches from our stimulus, right? Wherever the stimulus is coming in, that's where our awareness is pointed to. And if the stimulus is coming into your eyes, you're going to be aware of what your eyes are pointed at. So the thing to try and exercise with is putting your awareness someplace other than where your eyes are looking. And that's what you're going to have to do in this case, because when you stare at the dot or the form or whatever it is you're staring at, boom, it's going to disappear. You need to look off to the side and put your awareness where the dot is, or the form, or whatever, and keep your eyes pointed off center. Okay, that's the tricky part. It takes a little while to get that down. At least it did for me. And you'll also notice that when you start seeing these visions and colors or dots or lines or forms, they will be peripheral. They're not going to be right in front. They'll all be a little off center. And I've included an image here that kind of represents the field of vision. And it's kind of meant to indicate that about 20 degrees offset from the center of vision is where most of the activity that your eyes are going to pick up is going to be located. So in this picture, it's like the gray area is where you're going to be seeing most of the activity. Of course, this picture doesn't do it justice because it's just like a circle, but when you're actually out there, looking at this stuff, it's a much wider field, but you kind of get the idea. Now, if you can catch the stimulus, and I know that's a really, really vague, undefined concept in this context, but hopefully you'll get the sense of it, which is like you can hook your attention onto the stimulus, even though your eyes are pointing somewhere else. You'll find that the stimulus begins to increase, sometimes dramatically. Now, because the only way the brain can create visual stimulus is to stimulate the visual cortex in your head, which is wired to the optic nerve, the optic disc, and the retina, we can expect to see something that kind of looks like the shape of an optic nerve or an optic disc or the retina, which also happens to look like an eye. So I've included a picture here of the optic nerve and the iris and kind of how they're put together, and is representative of the kind of initial imagery that you might start seeing. Again, in my experience, once I could catch one of those stimuluses, it's like the current from the brain, the feedback loop gets closed, and just like the feedback loop when you put a microphone near a speaker, very quickly it starts to grow very fast. And by very fast here, I mean maybe a couple of minutes, not like an actual microphone and speaker. And at this point, the brightness of the image becomes so strong that you can look directly at it. So the images didn't look exactly like what I'm showing here now, but they had that same style, form, and sense to them. They were pretty close. So at first, you may see something like a barely perceptible donut shape, or some other kind of ring with a hole in it kind of shape. And because a simple donut floating in space is almost as boring as empty space, expect this barely perceptible donut eye shape thing to move, change, disappear, reappear, generally be unstable. And in my case, at least, the color or tint of this donut shaped cloud that was moving around always starts out as a faint but very beautiful shade of blue. But here's where you can take advantage of that instability using the same technique that you used previously to kind of create the shapes in this empty space by using your intention, your imagination and intention. And that is, when you see this ring with a hole in it shape, attempt to focus it, move it into a dot, make it more condensed. The way I imagine it is I imagine the donut round shape sliding down a tube, and the further away it gets, the smaller it gets. Because what happens is, as these signals now begin to move together, the image becomes brighter. It's a little tricky to get it down. It's like a balancing act. But once you do, the brain will acclimate to this, and it will kind of help you along. It'll start pulsing. Like as soon as the image condenses to a dot, and then there's this kind of moment of brighter light, and then that dissipates, it'll go back to being a round donut hole shaped thing, and you can then do it again. And it becomes a rhythm, a cycle. And each time you do that, the image gets a little more reinforced, so it becomes a little brighter. And what'll happen is, as the image condenses to something bright, the brighter it gets, the more you will see an illuminated object, which, at least in my case, looked like the optic nerve. And eventually the brightness gets to the point where the entire object becomes completely illuminated. And if you can maintain your awareness on that, put your attention, concentration, and awareness on that, at some point you are no longer manipulating this image. It's like you've opened a door to your brain that opens to a cathedral. And it's almost like falling into this giant space in your brain that is full of activity and information and has 1,000 different paths that lead out from it and into who knows how many parts of your brains that you're consciously not aware of. At this point, it's a whole nother experience. You've passed through this portal, or you've passed through this door, and everything changes and kind of takes on a life of its own. And we'll touch on what happens at that point a little bit later, because that's really where the journey starts. It's also very common that you might see an eye looking back at you, which seems a little spooky at first. It's like, what? Who's looking at me? The current working hypothesis is that the form that you are seeing is a function of the eye and brain relationship that determines the visuals. It's like a very Bauhausian concept, right? Where form follows function. If the nervous system of the eye-brain connection is stimulating itself, it's kind of natural that it's going to create something that looks like the eye-brain circuit. And this isn't only what we see when we start getting some of the visuals, when they begin becoming more defined, but when it gets really quite detailed and very bright and illuminated in multicolors. But at that point, it begins to take on a life of its own. Like the self-stimulating closed circuit that we created just hit escape velocity, and now it's taken on a life of its own, and it starts really morphing into all kinds of things. But usually I see it morphing into something like a flame, I guess would be the closest thing. It's more like it turns into forms of light that kind of resemble with the object I was looking at, the optic nerve, and then it just starts getting really creative from there, because I guess that's what the brain does. I've put an image up here that is actually derived from a photograph of an optic nerve and is extremely close, at least in style and form, to what I started to begin to see. And when I mean begin to see, I mean it got really bright, but it was predominantly violet and red. In the beginning, it changed a little later on. So there might be one small side effect that is interesting. So chances are, whoever's listening to this has not been doing this practice described above on a daily level already, which means that when you do this practice, you'll be working with new or weak neural pathways. As these pathways grow, the experience will become easier and more visual. In this way, it's similar to learning to play the piano or doing math in your head or that kind of stuff. The more you practice, the better the output. However, once these neural pathways begin to grow, they may start to contribute to your daily experience of reality. We've seen a similar phenomena with people who are exposed to virtual reality a lot. Their brain not only begins to work differently, but the VR processing skills that they develop will deploy themselves to the de facto reality of everyday life. This can be greatly beneficial, as we can see in the way we use VR today to improve and even heal the brains from diseases such as Alzheimer's, stroke, depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, PTSD, etc. The potential downside is that the brain may get confused between VR and de facto reality, but this is really only a problem when the person has some already underlying psychological issues. So if you have some of those, even though this isn't VR, although I would say it's a lot more intense and immersive and real than VR, this is probably not a good practice for you to engage in, because it's going to get really freaky. And if you're not well grounded and stable in your current reality, opening doors to new realities is just going to make your current reality even more unstable. And I know this because I speak from experience.